Biker punches 90-year-old veteran, not knowing who his son is. The sun was setting over the quiet town of Brooksville, a place where everyone knew each other, or at least they thought they did. At the local diner, a group of bikers roared into the parking lot, their engines echoing through the evening air. They were a rough-looking bunch, clad in leather jackets, tattoos covering their arms, and wearing an attitude of untouchable arrogance. Inside, sitting alone in the corner booth, was an old man named Walter Simmons. A 90-year-old World War II veteran, Walter had seen more battles than anyone in that town could imagine. His frail body was marked by time, but his spirit was unbroken. He was enjoying a cup of coffee, lost in thought, when the bikers barged in. One of them, a particularly large and aggressive man known as Razor, strutted toward the counter. "Hey, old man, you're in my seat," he growled, standing over Walter. Walter, ever the gentleman, looked up with calm, steady eyes. "I don't see your name on it, son." The diner fell silent. The waitress, an older woman who had served Walter for years, gasped quietly. She knew that trouble was brewing. Razor didn't take kindly to the response. "You got a smart mouth for someone who's about to lose his dentures," he sneered, before reaching for Walter's coffee and dumping it onto the floor. Walter sighed and reached for his napkin, wiping his hands. "No need for all that, young man," he said. But Razor wanted to make a point. He reached down, grabbed Walter by the collar, and pulled him up slightly. "I don't like your attitude," he growled. That was when Walter did something no one expected. He didn't flinch. He didn't beg. He simply smiled, a knowing, almost amused smile. This infuriated Razor. Without thinking, he pulled his fist back and struck Walter square in the face, sending the old man sprawling to the floor. The entire diner gasped. The waitress screamed. But Walter? He simply wiped the blood from his lip and sat up, still calm. "You shouldn't have done that," he muttered. Razor scoffed. "Yeah? And why's that, old-timer?" That was when the door burst open. A massive, broad-shouldered man in a military uniform stepped inside. His piercing blue eyes scanned the room until they locked onto Walter, his father, lying on the ground. This was Colonel James Simmons, a decorated Special Forces operative, trained in combat and feared by many. He had just returned home from deployment, only to find his father assaulted by a thug. The room fell into dead silence. The bikers, unaware of who they had just messed with, chuckled. "Who's this? Another old-timer coming to get smacked around?" James didn't say a word. Instead, he stepped forward, his entire presence radiating danger. His fists clenched, his stance was solid, and his gaze was unshaken. Razor, still unaware of the storm he had just invited, smirked and took a swing at James. It was a mistake he wouldn't live down. With lightning-fast reflexes, James sidestepped the punch, grabbed Razor's wrist, and twisted it with such force that a sickening crack echoed through the diner. Razor howled in pain as James slammed him onto the table, making plates and glasses shatter. The other bikers jumped to their feet, but James was already moving. A swift kick to the ribs sent one crashing into the jukebox. Another reached for a knife, but James disarmed him in a blink, flipping him onto the floor with expert precision. Within seconds, all 5 bikers were moaning on the ground, groaning in pain. James dusted off his uniform, then turned to his father. "You okay, Dad?" Walter smiled. "I was just about to teach them a lesson myself, but you beat me to it." The entire diner erupted in cheers. The waitress called the police, and soon, the bikers were hauled away in cuffs. As they were dragged out, Razor whispered, "Who the hell are you?" James knelt down and whispered in his ear, "I'm the son of the man you just punched." Razor's face turned ghost white as he was shoved into the back of a police car. That night, the town of Brooksville learned a valuable lesson. Never underestimate an old man, especially one with a son like Colonel James Simmons. And as for Walter, he simply sipped his new cup of coffee and muttered, "Some people just have to learn the hard way." The consequences as the police sirens faded into the distance, the diner slowly returned to normal. But the air was still thick with tension. The waitress, Margaret, hurried over to Walter with a concerned look. "Are you sure you're all right, Walter?" she asked, dabbing his forehead with a napkin. Walter chuckled. Takes more than that to knock me down, Maggie. James helped his father back into his seat, his sharp eyes still scanning the room as if expecting another threat. The other patrons stared in stunned silence, replaying what they had just witnessed. One man finally broke the silence. Colonel Simmons, I've heard of you. You were in that classified mission overseas, weren't you? James gave a tight-lipped smile but didn't respond. The military had trained him well. He never revealed more than necessary. Instead, he turned back to his father. You didn't tell me the town had gotten this rough, he said. Walter sighed. It ain't the town, son. It's just a few bad apples thinking they own the place. He took a sip of his fresh coffee. But you handled him just fine. James was still fuming. He had seen war, but nothing made his blood boil like seeing his father, his hero, disrespected and attacked. That's when Margaret leaned in closer and whispered, James, those bikers, they ain't just some random gang. They're part of the Iron Fangs. James stiffened. The Iron Fangs? Margaret nodded. They've been causing trouble around town for months, extorting small businesses, threatening people. The sheriff does what he can, but they always seem to slip through the cracks. James clenched his jaw. Not anymore. Walter sighed. Son, you just got home. You don't need to go picking fights. James shook his head. They already picked one, with you. The Iron Fangs hideout meanwhile, deep in the outskirts of town. In a rundown biker bar called the Fong Pit, Razor sat nursing his broken wrist while his gang gathered around. The leader, a towering man with a scar running down his left eye, listened to Razor's account with an eerie calmness. So let me get this straight. The leader, known as Viper, said in a gravelly voice. You picked a fight with an old man. Razor swallowed hard. I didn't know who he was. Viper leaned in. And then you got your ass handed to you by his son? Razor nodded, his face burning with shame. The other bikers snickered. Viper slammed his fist on the table, making everyone jump. Do you have any idea who James Simmons is? The room went silent. That man isn't just some soldier. He's a war hero, special forces, trained in things you wouldn't survive 5 seconds against. Viper exhaled and cracked his knuckles. And now, thanks to your stupidity, he knows about us. Razor wiped sweat from his forehead. So what do we do? Viper stood up, his shadow looming over the table. We remind him whose town this is. The retaliation the next night. As James sat on the porch of Walter's old farmhouse, he heard the unmistakable roar of motorcycles in the distance. His expression darkened. Walter, sitting in his rocking chair, took a slow drag of his cigar. Sounds like trouble. James didn't reply. He just stood up and grabbed the old hunting rifle from inside the house. Moments later, headlights appeared at the end of the long dirt driveway. 5, 6, 7 bikes rolled in, their riders masked in darkness. Viper stepped off his Harley, adjusting the leather gloves on his massive hands. Colonel Simmons, he called out, we need to talk. James, standing calmly at the top of the porch, held the rifle loosely in his hands. Talking doesn't seem to be your gang's strong suit, he replied. Viper smirked. Maybe not, but we're not here to fight. Yet. Walter, still rocking in his chair, exhaled a slow stream of smoke. Then why don't you say what you came to say? Viper's eyes flickered toward Walter before settling back on James. Here's the deal, soldier boy. You got lucky last night, but this ain't your battlefield, and it ain't your war. You and your old man mind your business, and we'll forget this ever happened. James tilted his head. And if we don't? Viper's smile vanished. Then this town's gonna start seeing some real problems. Fires, accidents, people going missing. James took a step forward, his eyes locked onto Viper's. You see, that's where you made a mistake, he said quietly. This is my battlefield. And now, this is my war. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Viper's face. Then, in one smooth motion, James lifted the rifle and fired a single shot, right past Viper's ear. The bullet struck the wooden post behind him, sending a splinter of wood flying. The gang flinched, their hands reaching for their weapons. Go ahead, James said coldly. Try it. The air was thick with tension. Finally, Viper let out a low chuckle and shook his head. You got guts, I'll give you that. He gestured for his men to back off. But this ain't over. As the bikes roared to life and disappeared into the night, Walter took another puff of his cigar and chuckled. Son, I think you just declared war. James smirked. Good. The last stand the night was quiet again, but James knew it wouldn't last. The Iron Fangs weren't the type to back down. If they couldn't intimidate him with words, they'd try something worse. James stood on the porch, deep in thought. Walter watched him from his rocking chair, the old man's weathered face unreadable. You always were a stubborn kid, Walter finally said. But I gotta admit, this reminds me of the old days. James glanced at his father. You ever deal with guys like this? Walter chuckled. Back in the war? Yeah. The names change, but bullies are always the same. Only way they learn is when you hit them harder than they expect. James nodded. Then I guess it's time to teach them a lesson. The trap James spent the next day preparing. He knew the Iron Fangs would come for revenge, and he had no intention of waiting around to be ambushed. Instead, he set a trap. The family barn, an old structure that had seen better days, was the perfect battleground. James fortified it with makeshift barricades, tripwires, and hidden vantage points. He rigged a few surprises, nothing deadly, just enough to send a message. As the sun dipped below the horizon, James and Walter sat inside the farmhouse, waiting. The tension was thick. Then, the sound came, the low growl of motorcycles in the distance. They're here, Walter muttered. James stood up, rolling his shoulders. Let's finish this. The gang arrived in full force. Nearly a dozen bikes pulled into the dirt road, their headlights casting long shadows. Viper led the charge, flanked by Razor and a few other bruisers. Come on out, soldier boy. Viper called, his voice echoing through the night. Time to settle this. James stood at the barn's entrance, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. You should have walked away, he said coldly. Viper sneered. Nah. See, you embarrassed us. And we can't have that. He motioned, and two bikers pulled out bats, striding toward James. That's when James triggered the first trap. A thick wire, hidden in the dirt, snapped tight as soon as the bikers stepped over it, yanking their feet out from under them. They hit the ground hard, groaning in pain. The rest of the gang tensed, pulling out weapons, but James was already moving. He dove behind a stack of hay bales, using them for cover as the gang rushed in. Walter, watching from the farmhouse window, smirked. Still got it, kid. One biker swung a bat, but James ducked, landing a precise punch to the ribs. Another lunged at him, but James grabbed his arm, twisting it until the man dropped to his knees. Viper snarled. Enough of this. He pulled out a gun, an old, rusted revolver. Walter saw it first. Before anyone could react, a deafening boom echoed through the night. James spun around. Walter stood on the porch, holding his old shotgun. Smoke curled from the barrel. Viper yelped, dropping his gun as the shot hit the ground near his feet. Walter grinned. Oops, must be getting old. My aim ain't what it used to be. Viper, now visibly shaken, looked around. Half his men were down, the others groaning in pain. He gritted his teeth. This ain't over. James took a step forward, his presence towering. Yes, it is. Viper's eyes darted to his injured men. He knew he had lost. Let's go, he spat, turning back to his bike. One by one, the gang retreated, their tails between their legs. As the last engine faded into the distance, Walter exhaled and sat back down in his chair. Well, that was fun. James shook his head, chuckling. You're unbelievable. Walter grinned. Runs in the family, kid. Epilogue news of what happened spread fast. The Iron Fangs never returned to Brooksville. Some said they disbanded. Others claimed they relocated. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the town was safe again. James stayed in town a little longer, fixing up the old farmhouse, spending time with Walter. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, Walter patted his son on the back. You ever think about settling down here? James smirked. Maybe. but only if you promise not to start any more fights with bikers. Walter laughed. No promises, kid. The two of them sat in comfortable silence, the weight of war, both past and present, finally lifted. And just like that, peace returned to Brooksville.